Hello, my name is Kevin, and I'm joined by my teammates Ziyang and Zhe to discuss our Capstone project, Beat Blade, the Implicit Rhythm platformer. To start, let's talk about our core concept. Implicit rhythm is an original term coined by me to describe a phenomenon I've observed in games. The best way I can describe it is rhythmic gameplay that's embedded in the world so the player reacts to it naturally, as opposed to asking the player explicitly to follow a certain non-diegetic timing. So for example, in Elden Ring, combat relies heavily on the player's timing. The player learns how and when the enemy attacks and responds in time, and this creates a sort of rhythm. In contrast, explicit rhythm would be something like Crypt of the Necrodancer, where the player has to follow a set beat all the time, which is indicated by the background music and HUD elements. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It lets you feel like you're playing with the music, and it's a great way to control the pace of the game. As the beat slowly gets faster, the gameplay gets more frantic and fast-paced to match. The problem is two major limitations: the lack of flexibility and the amount of conscious thought the player needs to spend on making sure they're following the timing. Our theory is that by removing these two limitations with implicit rhythm, we can create a game with better accessibility and an increased flow state.
So, background of our study, background research, existing rhythm games, including Citus and mobile rhythm game, Guitar Hero, instrument simulation, and the side B and VR rhythm game. Existing rhythm games are important to our study because we wanted to understand simulation fidelity in rhythm game controls. Rhythm hybrid games. One example is Hi-Fi Rush, a combat game, which used simulated controllers and UIs to create emergent rhythmic experience. Flowing games, meaning the player's flow state, which are rhythmic gameplay experience and macro level of flow state, or flow inside gameplays, which are challenges and difficulties. Rhythm in non-music games. Examples here are Elden Ring and Minecraft. This is for flow in gameplay loops, macro level flow state. Also, why implicit rhythm? Traditional or explicit rhythm limits player agency and flexibility to adjust their flow state, forces the player to think consciously about the rhythm aspect. Game makes playing less natural. Players play with fixed gameplay experience. Players has less control over the musical aspect. Again, simulation fidelity.
Our procedure involved participants playing one level in explicit mode and another in implicit mode, with the order randomized to prevent any sequence effects. After each level, they completed a survey based on the flow chart scale, which helped us measure their state of immersion in the game. We utilized a data logger to capture in-game events with timestamps, providing us with detailed behavioral data. Additionally, screen recordings were made, and we applied the sync-a-lot protocol to gain insights into the participants' thought processes. Quieter moments might suggest deeper immersion or flow state. The level survey specifically targeted the flow state, again using the flow chart scale, which is critical for understanding how the game design influences player experience. Finally, a post-trail survey gathered impressions of the game and collected background information such as the participants' skill levels and their experience with games and music. By integrating these tools, we aim to create a rich dataset that not only tracks performance but also captures the interaction between player and game. This will allow us to understand how different modes of rhythmic interaction influence the gaming experience.
In order to test how implicit rhythm affects flow differently from explicit rhythm, we decided to make a 2D side-scrolling action platformer with a simple combat system, something like Katana Zero, but with a rhythmic timing system underneath similar to Hi-Fi Rush. We decided on this type of game for a couple of reasons. First of all, flexible platforming, which is a platforming system that allows the player to freely move around, is hard to make rhythmic, but a simple hit-based combat system can be adjusted to follow a rhythm like a drum. So that gives us a combination of fluid movement and a rhythmic combat system. This sort of hybrid system is right in between traditional rhythm games and non-rhythm games, where implicit rhythm makes the most sense. Players can freely enter an existing combat situation, but enemies attack in a rhythmic way that players must respond to in time. In order to test this, we created a basic 2D stage with a player that can run, jump, and attack. We then added an enemy type that runs to the player and attempts to hit them with a sword. When an enemy attacks the player, they must first wind up for one beat before attacking. In implicit mode, the game doesn't tell the player when the beat is, but if we turn on explicit mode, now the player can hear the beat and see it with the indicator on the top right. This beat is tracked by an internal beat system which all enemies listen to decide when to attack. This means attacking is always on beat. The player is encouraged to match this timing because if they attack at the same time as the enemy, this results in a counter which stuns the enemy. Hitting a stunned enemy does double damage. This prototype is pretty basic. There are a lot of things we plan to add in the future, including actual levels, which we need for that fluid platforming element of our design and to give players an actual end goal. A rebalanced combat system that doesn't let the player just spam the attack button. A separate block or parry button, which is mostly to make the counter system less buggy. And of course, a lot of improvements to animation and sound effects. We're also looking into background music, which can line up with the beat, and maybe we can adjust the sound effects to be more musical so it sounds like the player is playing with the music. That would be moving in the generative music direction, which might be out of scope for us right now.
Moving on to our project's current status, we've made substantial progress in our methodology with the data logger at 95% completion. Screen recording, flow short skill survey, and post-trail survey are fully developed. On the development side, our gameplay elements are coming along, with the moment system at 80%, the beat system at 75%, but the combat system and levels need more work at 50% and 5% respectively. Art and music are in the early stages, with music still awaiting development.
Rough timeline. We will spend 1 week on our methodology, including data logger and survey refinement and implementation. We will spend 8 weeks on our game development and design, including level design, combat system, and beat system, and 2 weeks for playtest and survey with participants. We will include screen recording, playtest data gathering, and survey result. Approximately a week on data analysis, including graph generating and survey result graphing. And finally, we will spend about 3 weeks on our final written report and presentation.
So, why does this all matter? Recently, we've started seeing a bunch of hybrid rhythm games pop up, and I think this research will help further develop how those kinds of games are made in the future. Implicit rhythm could potentially help designers add rhythm to the kinds of games that we don't usually think of as compatible with rhythm gameplay. On the other hand, we're seeing some games that most wouldn't consider rhythm games use these elements to elevate their gameplay with better flow, and I think a better understanding of what exactly is happening here and why would help players improve these games even more. You'll notice we haven't talked a lot about actual music games, and there's a pretty simple reason for that. Right now, most music games don't give the player much room for improv. Usually, you choose a song, and you're prompted with a bunch of notes that you have to play back at the right time. This is pretty far on the explicit side of the implicit versus explicit scale, and that's fine, but I do think there might be potential for something a little less structured. Jazz, for example, is famously all about improv, and I think a jazz game that uses implicit rhythm, like say, asking the player to react to how their bandmates are playing, would be pretty interesting. I've tried to define implicit and explicit rhythm pretty specifically for the sake of this study, but like with most game design, I think once you look at real applications, things become a bit muddier. If you look hard enough, all games have a little rhythm to them.